All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at our PCBs and building materials awareness and removal. I'm going to ask folks at this time to mute their. How are we doing now? Great. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're really thrilled to have everyone here to learn a little bit about PCB remediation in building materials. This is the third education event we are doing in this outreach and education series, and we'll have a lot more to share about that. But for now, I want to start by thanking our project partners, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Washington State Department of Ecology, and our remediation specialists today, Pacific Rim Environmental, who are our go-to experts on all things related to PCBs, but also lead, asbestos-containing materials, you name it. So we're really excited to have them all here. We'll have introductions here shortly. So a little about us. My name is Daniel Pope. I'm the executive director of the Seattle and Bellevue 2030 districts. The 2030 districts are membership nonprofits composed of property owners, property managers, architects, engineers, contractors, developers, all of whom are committed to achieving the 2030 targets, which is a 50% reduction in energy, water, and transportation emissions by the year 2030. We do this work in a variety of ways, including doing individual building performance analysis, where we look at our individual buildings and let them know how they're doing towards these targets, but we also do a lot of education programming. So for those of you who have followed along with us in the past, you might be aware of our Water Week that we just hosted at the end of February. We're also going to be hosting an Energy Week at the beginning of June, and then a Transportation Week at the end of October. So if you're interested and you like what you're learning about today and want to learn more, please join us for one of those weeks. We think they're a really fantastic way to learn about how to make buildings more sustainable. We are one of 24 2030 districts. Seattle was actually the first 2030 district, founded in 2011, but the 2030 district now expanded across North America. So we're in places like Dallas.
I'll be
Pittsburgh.
here early too, so I'll probably be here when you're here tomorrow.
It does sound like we're getting a little. I'll ask everyone to mute themselves for now.
And then supposedly Dylan and I are supposed to,
going to
just go.
Lincoln.
I mean, Lincoln. How far is Lincoln now? Hour and a half?
Okay, great. So we're across North America, and we're already doing quite a bit in this space. But there's always room for new municipalities to join. So if you represent a municipality that is interested in joining the 2030 district, just reach out. We would love to get involved. All right, and with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Emma Dexter is the Sustainability Program Coordinator for the Seattle and Bellevue 2030 districts. Emma holds a BA in Environmental Studies and an MA in Coastal Communities and Regional Development, and she joined our 2030 district team back in November of 2024. She's been managing the PCBs and building materials outreach and education campaign and is our in-house expert on all things related to PCBs. So with that, I'm going to let Emma take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to speak to you today about PCBs and building materials. The intent of this workshop is to inform the community of polychlorinated biphenyls and their presence in the local building stock. So in addition to providing an overview of PCBs today, our purpose is to provide resources that aid in the identification and removal of PCBs from building materials to protect our human and environmental health. These workshops are also a component of our vision for expanding the reach of this education and outreach campaign. So our goal as we step into this new phase of our project is to connect with partner organizations across Washington State and replicate the educational programming we've been piloting in King County. So I'll touch more on this at the end of today's presentation, but as you listen, keep in the back of your mind whether this material is something you'd like to see presented in your own region, or if there's an audience you think it'd be really valuable for us to get out in front of. So to provide a brief outline of the agenda for today, we're going to begin with the basics of PCBs to ensure we're all on the same page before we dive into the regulations at play. From there, we're going to move on to discuss the identification and removal of PCB-containing materials. We'll give an overview of the resources available through the Washington Department of Ecology and EPA's website, and then we'll conclude today's event with a Q&A session. Just some quick guidance on questions. Please write any you have in the chat and we'll try to answer them as we go. Also try to pause regularly to take some questions, and then of course we'll end with our Q&A session. We're really lucky today to be joined by two incredible speakers. We have Allison Lewis from Pacific Rim Environmental and Paul Bianco from the Washington Department of Ecology. You'll be hearing from them very shortly. And then one last housekeeping item. You're able to earn continuing education credits from attending today's session. If this is something you're interested in, please send us your email as well as your AIA or USGBC number, and we can report your continuing education credits. One note, however, is that you can't earn more credits by retaking the same course. So that's something to keep in mind if you attended this workshop last November or December and received credits for that. So, all right, now that we have all that covered, we're going to just dive right into what you need to know about PCBs. So what are PCBs? In short, polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, are a class of synthetic chemicals that are not found naturally in the environment. They were developed by Monsanto, and there are 209 different compounds within this class. They're commonly known as Aeroclar, their trade name, and they were manufactured for a variety of purposes and used in a variety of common building materials, which we'll cover more shortly. While the manufacture of PCBs was banned in 1979, they can still be found in buildings built or renovated before or around this time. This is because the ban was on the manufacturing of PCBs rather than the use of PCB-containing materials. Thus, contractors used PCB-containing materials that were already in their possession throughout the decade. So consequently, buildings constructed or renovated between 1980 and 1989 are also at risk of containing PCBs, though this risk is a bit lower. So PCB-containing building materials can pose health risks and contaminate stormwater, soils, sediments, and indoor air. They're persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic chemicals. And we're going to dive more into what all this means. So being bioaccumulative means that chemicals build up over time in people and animals through constant exposure, and they're going to become more concentrated in organisms at the top of the food chain. So this means it can go from plankton to herring, then to salmon, and ultimately in orcas or humans, depending on who's eating them. PCBs impact salmon populations, they impact southern resident killer whales, sediments and organisms in Washington rivers, lakes, and estuaries. So a lot of impacts to our local ecosystems. They also take a long time to break down, so they remain in the environment as well as living organisms for a really extended period. The presence of this toxic chemical means that they're going to damage the environment and living organisms. PCBs have a toxic effect on the immune, reproductive, nervous, and endocrine systems in people and other organisms. They are known to cause cancer in animals, and they're very likely to cause cancer in people. Even at really low concentrations, PCBs in water can impact aquatic life and human health. They're really considered to be one of the most significant toxic chemicals in the Puget Sound, and they can cause a cloud of health impacts, which are pictured here. One of the most infamous examples of these harms is the school in Monroe, Washington, where a lot of children became ill due to this exposure to PCBs, and that resulted in a huge settlement with Monsanto. Many of you might have heard of this local one. There are a lot of numerous routes and sources of exposure that are possible depending on where you're coming from. So for humans, diet is the primary exposure route. This could look like consuming seafood that's been contaminated with PCBs that have found their way into our waters. And the sources can include, conducting workplace repairs and maintenance on items that contain PCBs. It can be due to improper removal, contact with old appliances, or electrical equipment accidents. This list pictured here is not exhaustive, but these are a lot of common exposure sources to look out for. And then here are pictured a list of common building materials in which PCBs are present. A few include paint, insulation materials, sprayed on fireproofing, fluorescent lighting ballasts, caulk, and grout. So as you can see, there are many materials that contain PCBs either in a liquid or a non-liquid form. And this is because they were intentionally added to such a wide array of materials because they were able to improve flexibility, adhesion, and durability. So they had a lot of functionality during this period. So they ended up being included in a lot of different materials. So when PCBs are present in exterior building materials, natural processes or human activities can cause PCBs to enter the environment. There are a lot of different triggers and pathways. These include, weather, building maintenance, debris, indoor air, and stormwater. It's really important to be conscious of these pathways in order to prevent the flow of PCBs from our built environment to our natural environment. This also can mean that precipitation and pressure washing can move PCBs from building materials and surface soils and the air into our stormwater. Construction debris that is disturbed can release PCBs and they can circulate in the air, contaminating other materials and affecting indoor air quality. This is why capturing and properly disposing of things like wash water and construction debris can help disrupt this process and prevent that flow into our waterways. So before I hand things over to Paul Bianco to talk about the regulations and laws about PCBs, are there any questions right now? All right, if not, I'm going to hand it over to Paul then.
Thank you, Emma. It's easy to take yourself off mute. Okay, welcome everybody. What's the law? Okay, next slide. So there's not a lot, so there's only a couple slides here, but the main two laws that regulate PCBs are from the EPA, which is known as the Toxic Substances Control Act, or better known as TSCA. And this basically banned the use of PCBs or the production of PCBs in 1980, I believe, or 79. And then we have the Washington State Department of Ecology's Model Toxic Control Act. And under the Model Toxic Control Act, PCBs and building materials aren't regulated. But we do regulate the cleanup of PCBs if they impacted soil or groundwater, or there are some specific items that we do regulate, such as transformers, transformer oil, and things like that, but not necessarily building materials that are on the outside of the buildings. All that is regulated by TSCA. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's a big one, remediation waste versus bulk product waste. So when we're talking about the outside of buildings and the building materials, remediation waste would be due to spills, things you have a transformer oil spilled on the ground, and cleanup. Now, TSCA will regulate this, but so does market, because it's a spill and it's a remediation project. But as far as building materials, they're considered bulk product waste, which is actually easier to regulate than a spill that you have to clean up, which would have cleanup levels and things like that. So bulk product waste, it's derived from manufactured products. They put it in a lot of different stuff back in the day. The main things that you probably would see it in would be caulking or paint or things like that. And it could get to pretty high levels that they put in. It worked really well. But as we know, it's not the best thing for the environment. So TSCA doesn't regulate building materials under 50 ppm. However, anything above 50 ppm, and you know it's above 50 ppm, you have to, or parts per million, you have to address once it's identified in those materials. TSCA can be challenging to navigate because PCB remediation waste requires you to follow CFR 76161, where bulk product waste, you follow a different 76162. So make sure you know which one you're following. And TSCA focuses on disposing of the PCB sources, but doesn't incentivize identifying PCB sources or easily address the lower PCB concentrations because it's under 50 ppm. It's up to you whether you want to address it or not, according to TSCA. Next slide. Okay, some other laws that don't completely deal with PCBs, but you might find yourself in because TSCA doesn't basically tell you you have to sample for PCBs. However, there could be other laws that would trigger that. So we want to make you aware, and the water quality here at Ecology would be the best people to discuss this with you if you had questions. So there's a couple, RCWs. It's unlawful to discharge to pollute state waters. Surface waters must be protected for designated use. And, if you're going for a NIPDES permit, they might ask you about these things. The latest revision of the Ecology Stormwater Management Manual, which was released in last year in July, now has references to PCBs in it. So you may be asked if you want a permit of some kind about your building and the possibilities of PCBs. You could also stormwater permits or local city permits might ask you about this if they find high PCBs in a storm drain or catch basin or something like this. So be aware that this is out. Next slide. So the triggers and timelines, discovery of PCBs. Again, if they're above 50 ppm, you have to do something about it. I would highly recommend, because this is not an ecology regulatory thing, I would highly recommend going to the EPA. They have a very good website and a contact name, and discuss it with them before you go crazy doing something that you might not have to do or have to do. And they will help you greatly with exactly what sampling you do. Or you can, in order to save money, you can assume that you have PCBs above 50 ppm, and then you don't have to sample at all and just dispose of them according to the proper disposal procedures. So if you are going to abate, there are certainly many things that Allison will talk about in the future slides that you would generally be required to do, work plan, health and safety plan, things like that. Basically, we don't want people abating buildings and poisoning themselves as they're doing it. So, but that's, again, that you would deal with your EPA representative for that. And every site is different. It's a big building compared to a small building is much different how you approach it and how you clean it up. And I think that's all I have for. I think I'll pass it back to Emma or on to Allison to discuss the rest.
Hello, everyone. My name is Allison with Pacific Rim Environmental. Today, we're going to talk about a case study for a project that we were involved with in the Olympia Capitol. And that was for the Pritchard Library building that is currently being remodeled. I'm also going to kind of talk about the sampling and what is required for sampling and just kind of the reasoning behind it and the requirements for it. Next slide. So to identify PCBs, step one, you really got to look into the construction and year of your structure. Certain buildings have characteristics that are more likely to contain PCBs, and a lot of that is the type of building materials that were used. As mentioned before, the EPA banned PCBs prior to 1980, so any buildings built after that, they're a lot less likely to have it. And sampling for those would not be applicable like for a building built in the 2000s. First, second, you want to identify and inventory any suspected materials. As we've listed, there's window caulking, door caulking, any coating, asbestos, paneling, And you want to identify what could potentially be PCBs so you can start to determine what your best management practices are to prevent any leaching into stormwater or into your air for your workers. Next slide. For sampling, if you would like to have a professional environmental consultant perform sampling, we do have minimum requirements based on the square footage or lineal feet of building material. As listed here, for 1 to 1,000 square feet of the homogeneous material, say a paint coating, if it's between 1 and 1,000, you would take a minimum of 3 samples. This is a best practice that has been identified by EPA that's in relation to AHERA building surveys sampling. And that's where this kind of numbering system has come from. While you're creating a sampling plan or performing sampling, you want to review the records and determine what the best plan will be, and this will also help with cost estimating as well. Once you sample, or as you're sampling, you want to identify an accredited laboratory that does PCB analysis. Here in Washington, there are a few, so you don't have to send them all out. Next slide. As part of this PCBs, they are not a homogeneous material throughout the building material. As kind of represented here, PCBs are distributed unevenly throughout. So if you take a sample, you may get a section that has small amounts, you may get a section that has larger amounts, and that's why QC sampling is very important for analysis and determining PCBs for your building. Next slide. So moving on, the Pritchard Library, this is a case study for the remediation that was undertaken at this building. It was the objective of Pacific Rim Environmental to identify the PCBs, help develop correct removal processes and the disposal requirements, working with the EPA to provide the safest work environment for all the trades who were in this building. Next slide. All right, PCBs were first identified during a regulated building materials survey as part of the renovation project. During this, a asphaltic expansion joint was found in the basement, but due to the occupation of the building, it was not vacant at the time, only minimal sampling was conducted until the building was vacated and demolition could begin. Carpet was overlaying the basement subfloor, and one of our inspectors happened to cut the carpet at just the right spot to find these joints and take a sample. Next slide. There we go. Once this was found, we went back to the Capitol and DES and requested any as-built drawings or any information that they've had previously performed in this building. And as shown here on this as-built plans in the basement, dummy joints were on all the column lines, and this allowed us to quantify the full extent of the joints and identify areas to sample prior to soft demo. Next slide. Because of the nature of PCBs, we did also have to perform leachate sampling in the substrate. In this case, there was concrete on either side of the expansion joints. We took samples from 2 inches and 4 inches away from the joint to determine the distance of how far the PCBs have leached into the concrete. We did this because as part of the remediation method, the abatement contractor was going to saw cut the concrete on either side of the expansion joints to prevent disturbing the joints themselves. This would allow them to then remove the concrete with the expansion joint and dispose of them. Another part of this sampling was a geotechnical firm, geoengineers, performed soil sampling in the core locations to determine if the PCBs had leached beneath the concrete and into the soil. Thankfully, they did not. Next slide. So since PCBs were identified, we had to develop an abatement strategy for the removal process. When you do this, you want to work with environmental professionals, your abatement contractor, and the EPA, and you want to base your strategy on their sampling results, prioritize them on the levels, the characterization of your disposal. You want to notify the EPA at this stage if you're required. You want to notify the EPA at this stage and determine what disposal method may be required. In some cases, PCBs require incineration. Thankfully, for this material, that was not required, which greatly reduced the cost of disposal. As you're conducting removal and abatement, you want to contain the waste and immediately transport it to the designated storage area in compliance with TSCA and determine the appropriate disposal methods. Working with a disposal professional really helps at this point in the project. They help you determine where it is going to be taken and any requirements that may be needed as well. The abatement contractor should keep daily field notes and on-site activities, prepare an abatement report upon completion, and keep these on file, and the owners keep these on file for 3 to 5 years. As you are preparing these documents, you want to take protective measures and consider the type of material subject to removal when choosing removal methods and decontaminate the area following abatement. Next slide. In the case of the Pritchard Library, the PCB abatement lasted 4 weeks with an average crew size of 10 to 15 people. There was approximately 2,200 lineal feet of expansion joint and 4,400 lineal feet of concrete removed via saw cutting. Once the cuts were made, manual methods were used to remove this material and place into drums. Next slide. For a total of 6 weeks with soft demo, the site was PCB free. The slurry created from the saw cutting was contained in 55-gallon steel drums, and 1/3 of them was sampled for waste determination. It was found that this material was not greater than 1 part per million, and it could be disposed of safely in standard landfill. Next slide. So in working with the Department of Ecology, we have helped create a cost estimating spreadsheet, and as we'll go over that shortly in the resources as well. That will help include what costs need to be determined for abatement. Next slide. During projects that have PCBs, you need to have the following at the end of any project or determination. 1, the source of the spill, date and time of the spill that is best known, brief description of where it was and what the materials were that maybe have been contaminated, a description of the clean soil surfaces and the approximate depth and amount of soil removed if applicable. Post-cleanup verification sampling data may come from wipe sampling, air sampling data, visual inspection, and closeout paperwork, with a description of the sample methodology and disposal characterization. Optional estimated cleanup costs. The EPA should receive notification of completion within 30 days of sending the final waste shipment for disposal. Next slide. All right. Perfect. All right. Over the years, the Department of Ecology and the EPA have made several guidance documents, question and answer sheets, diagrams for processes, and lists of disposal companies and the appropriate landfills to make handling projects that involve PCBs easier and more manageable. Next slide. Here we're going to provide some specific resources that are readily available to you. Up first, from the Department of Ecology, this document, pictured here, will help you to inventory and sample suspect PCB materials in your facility if you would like to do this prior to hiring an environmental professional. It also provides steps for safe work practices for managing in place and for removal or abatement by certified contractors. Second, if property owners or operators are not planning on a renovation or demolition and have concerns that manufactured PCB products may be present in a building or structure, they may wish to consider determining the presence of manufactured PCBs. However, before testing, EPA recommends they first consult and take the actions outlined in the EPA guidance for school administrators and building owners, which includes information about managing PCBs and building materials to help minimize possible exposures to building occupants. PCB waste must be characterized before disposal. The third document here, the Dangerous Waste Guide, helps provide information on the dangerous waste. Only dangerous waste transporters who have notified Ecology and registered with the Department of Transportation can move PCB waste off-site for disposal. The PCB waste must be properly contained and sent to an approved transfer facility or landfill, and this can be done by hiring a notified waste transporter and/or disposal specialist. The generator of the PCB waste is ultimately responsible for proper waste management and disposal. And last, disposal options and requirements. In 2023, the EPA released a new rule, alternate PCB extraction methods and amendments to PCB cleanup and disposal regulations. Some of the updates from this allow for the disposal of non-liquid PCB remediation waste at RCRA Subtitle C landfills under 40 CFR 76161B, and this has greatly reduced the cost of disposal for property managers and building owners.
Allison, we've got a quick question coming from the chat.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's related to Pritchard Library.
Yes.
Was the entire building vacated during the testing and abatement period?
During the initial survey, the building was not vacant, but during the additional testing of the expansion joints and the abatement, the entire building was vacant, except for other trades that were performing demolition work in the building. Great question. Any others for the case study? All right. A driving force behind spreading awareness of PCBs is the damage it causes to our waterways, as we've mentioned. The protection of our stormwater system from PCB runoff is one of Ecology's main objectives. Ecology has provided a 2024 Stormwater Management Manual for Western Washington. Within this manual, there are many tools and information for all types of industries. The 4 highlighted here are sections that can be navigated to in the document's table of contents and may relate most to the work you may be involved in. This includes roof drains, manufacturing and commercial buildings, washing and steam cleaning vehicles, equipment, and buildings, construction demolition, and building repair, remodeling, painting, and construction. Next slide. So now we are coming to the cost estimating tool that Ecology and PACRIM have developed for PCB abatement. This link that you will receive provides an Excel tool that includes a framework with fillable fields where you can enter data to estimate your project's costs. We helped create this in conjunction with Ecology's How to Find and Address PCBs and Building Materials document. Before using the Excel tool, I do recommend reading the How to Estimate Abatement Project Cost for PCBs document, and this will explain how to use it and its limits and assumptions it takes into consideration. This was made in 2022 and does not include current rate costs or inflation. So there may be a little difference in costs. Next slide. So here we have the different websites that have the PCB information for Ecology and EPA and EPA's PCBs and building materials. There are many resources providing information on PCBs and an explanation of the regulations surrounding them. PCBs is a major issue. However, they don't need to be scary or unmanageable to learn. Today, there are numerous resources and tools available for all levels of professionals. And there are teams from EPA and Ecology and consulting firms around the area that are ready and available to help answer your questions. Paul, is there any resources you'd like to add?
I think you covered them all. Good job.
All right,
You
Emma.
have a
I'll-
couple-
The only thing I would add is, like I said, the EPA has great materials on their website. You know, we showed a lot of Department of Ecology, but don't forget the EPA regulates this material.
Paul, I think we're having a little trouble hearing you. I'm not sure there's something going on with the mic.
Huh. Can you hear me now?
That's better.
Okay. I'll try to speak up as loud as I can. I would also add that the EPA, since they regulate it, they also have great documents on their websites. I know we presented a lot from the Department of Ecology, but the EPA has a bunch of good stuff and contact information on their websites as well.
All right, wonderful. Well, I also wanted to highlight a couple other resources about other toxics, really highlighting PCBs here, but there's a strong likelihood that if you run into PCBs, you could also be running into lead or asbestos or other issues, and vice versa. So there's a lot of great resources from the EPA about other toxics, including things like formaldehyde, mercury, PFAs, things like that are in a lot of building materials as well. There's a great resource from the Housing Development Consortium that highlights some exemplary building programs related to their healthy building program. There's also a resource from Toxic Free Future and the Living Futures Red List, which highlights some resources for identifying materials that might be in your buildings that could be impacting your human and environmental health. And then there's also a great resource from Habitable about plastics and building materials. So you know, PCBs are our main focus here, but it's not a mutually exclusive issue with a lot of other hazards to keep in mind. So there's a lot of overlap and potential for testing for things at the same time. And there's potentially a lot of benefits that can come with that. So we wanted to highlight that as well. Now, before we jump into our Q&A section, I wanted to wrap up our presentation material by just recognizing our project partners and thanking our funding sponsors once again. So Hackram Environmental, the Department of Ecology, and the EPA. Clearly, Daniel and I are not the experts on this topic ourselves, so we're really grateful to Pacific Rim Environmental and Ecology for contributing their knowledge and their firsthand experience, as well as their time to this education and outreach campaign. We really couldn't be sharing this material without them. Now, before we jump in, I just wanted to tell you again that we've developed a really great toolkit to replicate this workshop in your jurisdiction. It includes material from promotional collateral to sample emails and social media posts for your outreach, as well as the slides themselves. And we're really determined to make hosting a workshop as low a lift as possible. So please let us know if this is something you'd be interested in. And now we'd like to open it up and take your questions. Daniel, I think you have a couple to get us started now.
I do, and before I do, I also wanted to share that our funding comes from the EPA and by way of the Washington State Department of Ecology through a program called the Stormwater Strategic Initiative, which is funding work like this in a variety of different projects. And it's being supported by Commerce and the Washington State University. So we're really thankful to all of them for supporting all of this work. And with that, yeah, we'll jump into some of the questions, and then we'll kick it to Allison and Paul to try and answer those that we can. So the first one comes to us with a general question. They said, I work for a municipal stormwater program. Recently, Ecology changed their permit for smaller city programs to begin prohibiting non-pressurized building wash water, which may contain PCBs, from being allowed to be discharged into the city's stormwater system. In order for cities to efficiently administer this change, cities would be greatly served by a field rapid assessment tool to allow inspectors to verify building wash operations that must be prohibited. Has anyone here heard of a PCB rapid field assessment tool or the development of one? So I think that's a question for either Paul or Allison. Is there something out there that can help people figure out if PCBs are present quickly?
Well, I could tell you, and to age myself, probably 20 years ago, I used one. However, I wouldn't call it rapid or easy to use. but it did allow me to do a field test for PCBs, and I believe its limit was like 1 ppm. So that's where it cut off. However, I wouldn't recommend that for, one test could take 2 hours kind of thing. It was a little bit of chemistry work involved in it. But I would hope maybe I don't know of anything newer, but I haven't looked into it either. So maybe they've come a long way in the rapid testing. Allison, do you know anything?
Not on the rapid testing side, other than taking a sample and going to a lab and getting rush reporting on it, which significantly increases the cost. But in the last couple years, the UW has developed in partnership it's called Field Lab, and it is a canine detection dog who has been trained to sniff out PCBs. They work with Seattle Public Utilities, and what they do is they go and they sniff out the buildings in an area where Seattle Public Utilities has identified PCBs and stormwater, and then the SPU takes samples to the lab for verification. Obviously, there is some QC that has to be done. You want to take samples still, but it is a service that could provide quick analysis or at least indication of if more investigation is needed. Unfortunately, PCBs kind of like asbestos, the techniques for sampling and analysis is still very manual, and it takes the instrumentation or visual assessment by an analyst to determine. But that is a recent one. If you would like to look them up, they're called Field Lab Detection, and they are located here in the Seattle area. And I have spoken with her in the last few weeks, and she is building up her website and getting her name out there and looking to work with more individuals.
Are hoping to have the dog in question as a presenter at our next webinar, so stay tuned for that.
Or maybe the in-person.
Or maybe the in-person event. Yeah, that'll be great. The next question comes from our friends in Skagit County. What is the proper sampling protocol? Do you simply cut a chunk of building materials into a ball and transport it to the lab? Allison, I think this one's for you.
Yeah, so it is a little more involved than that. The first resource I did share in the resources side, the Department of Ecology's PCB and building materials does have steps for sampling. There is also the EPA has a resource for how to take samples. This involves latex gloves or any sort of gloves really, glass jars, cleaning your instruments between samples if you're taking more than one, and refrigerating them, but if you can't get them to the lab immediately, whether that's in a cooler or in a refrigerator overnight. So if you're taking more than one, you need to clean each of your tools before you moving on to the next sample. Depending on the material you're taking, if it's an expansion joint, you're taking either a chisel and a hammer or a knife, and you're simply cutting a chunk out of that and putting it into the jar, sealing it, and putting it into a cooler. If you're taking PCB or suspect PCB wall coatings, you could use a knife and scrape some of that off. There's always PPE that is involved in this: gloves, face masks, water, and potentially eyewear as well. Eye protection is very important. You just want to do all you can to prevent any exposure and contact with the skin.
Great, thank you, Allison. Another question that's come up from our friends in Spokane Valley: if PCBs are discharged to a city's stormwater system, where can that water be disposed of? Is there an allowable concentration to keep it under a dangerous/hazardous waste threshold?
Well, if it's already been discharged to the stormwater system, I would assume it's gone on its way unless there's some sort of collection point. typically, I don't know that there would be. And typically when they test stormwater system, they'll test the sediment in the basin or something like that to see if there's PCBs in it. You kind of know that the stormwater was impacted. But it can certainly be disposed of. Off the top of my head, I will refer you to one of, if you go back a couple slides, Emma. One more. Oh no, go forward. Forward. Sorry. One more forward. Let's see. Don't see it. Okay, right there. That fourth number, disposal options and requirements for PCB waste. That has and that we developed last year, I believe, Allison.
Yes.
And that has a very simple table that say, this is what I got, where do I take it? We tried to make it as simple as possible, though nothing is simple. So I would refer you to that one where it can be disposed of. Or you could also look in the dangerous waste guide. You might have some help there. As far as an allowable concentration under a dangerous waste, I would imagine there is one. I don't know what that is off the top of my head. But yes, I would guess there is one. It would be a dangerous waste based on dangerous waste regulations in the state of Washington, which was 173.303.100 in the WAC. So you would probably figure out whether it's a dangerous waste based on that regulation.
Great. So another question that's come up a few times, and we touched on this earlier, and this one I guess is probably for Paul. But what are a property owner's legal responsibilities regarding testing for PCBs and contamination on their property? And maybe you could also touch on a few of the ways that this comes up for people and how they end up potentially getting found to be responsible.
There is no regulation that says you must test for PCBs in your building materials. But that's kind of why we gave that slide about the water quality these days, and it's becoming more and more known. If somebody suspects you have PCBs, then they may require you to test. TSCA does not require you to test for PCBs. But there might be some other reason why you have to. If you want a permit of, stormwater permit, they might require you to. If you want something else done to the building, a demo permit, they might require you to. There's also, certainly if people are in there working or demoing parts of the building, they could be exposed to PCBs, which you wouldn't want, and legal ramifications from that. So while there's no law saying you have to test for them, there are other things that could come into play that would make you, or certainly you would have to if you want to do something to the building.
A lot of those also stem from disposal landfill requirements, knowing what the characterization of your disposal material is, hazard communication for workers and others in the building for different renovation or demolition projects. Indoor air quality is a big one that really begins the sampling process. In the Puget Sound area for L&I, there's the Good Faith Survey for asbestos. They kind of use that term loosely for all regulated materials, knowing what the hazards are, and hazard communications for the workers performing the work and the other employees in the area and the general public. So those may be what is jump-starting the need for PCBs. As Paul mentioned, there's not just a explicit law saying you have to test for PCBs. It's these other contributing factors that require it.
We got a question from Joey. So the issues with PCBs and stormwater is more an issue of the transport of contaminated sediment or dust, not PCBs dissolved in the water itself, but the suspended sediments.
No, that's not what I meant at all. It certainly will be contaminated sediment and dust, but it's certainly dissolved in the water as well. Yeah, and that gets there much faster than the sediments or dust.
And Allison, just going back a little bit, for you, do you have kind of the most common triggers that end up triggering a PCB abatement process? What are you guys seeing as the most frequent first step that ends up getting people to have to go down this road?
Usually it's sampling. If sampling has been performed already, for any renovation or demolition, a good faith survey is required in the state of Washington. If you're using an environmental consultant, they should be looking for any suspect regulated or hazardous materials that could be impacted due to these plans.
Another thing may be, if you want to sell the building and, due diligence. Somebody who's buying it might want a survey.
Exactly. They want to know what the hazards are and what the potential hazards are in that building if they do decide to renovate it. We also get requests for surveys because people ask, what are the hazards here? What are you doing? And then so that jump starts it. Nowadays, the EPA and most regulatory agencies do not use ignorance as a defense. So getting the information out there and knowing what the potential hazards are and what you need to do about it is most important. Because if it is there, you have to do something about it to protect not only your workers, but the public and other people.
Great. Here's another one. I think this is probably in Paul's area. This is from Corey Olson in the Spokane Valley. Our municipal NPDES permit says, quote, structures confirmed or suspected of to have PCB-containing materials shall not discharge wash down to the MS4. Is there an acceptable and preferred discharge location for PCB-contaminated runoff?
I would say, because I don't want to speak for water quality, I would say you contact your water quality permit writer or somebody from water quality and ecology and ask them. I can envision, my opinion, that they will give you a discharge location. When we talk about stuff for that, it might be something as simple as putting in, where the runoff's going to go because you got your stormwater system probably already there. Maybe put some carbon socks in, or filters or something before the water to try and treat the water before it gets to the storm. There could be some other BMPs, but it'd be more BMP associated rather than you put it here. I would imagine is what they're going to tell you. But follow up with water quality before you take my word for that.
They do have a lot of stormwater BMPs on Ecology's website, the best management practices for protecting stormwater and the different tools and methods to do that. There's collecting the water as it's run off. There's blocking the storm drains and treating it like Paul mentioned and avoiding different methods that cause the spill or contamination.
Great. We did have here's another question. So there are effective in situ treatment options.
I'm trying to remember for stormwater runoff, there are options out there to protect it and to treat it. Usually it's collecting it and disposing of it as PCB contaminated waste or containing waste. But there are methods to prevent stormwater runoff.
And it looks like in response to an earlier
So
question.
wait, to go back to that question, it says in situ treatment options. Are you talking about the building materials that are on the building itself, treatment for that? For runoff, I would imagine there's something out there in the VMP world that would treat it. And it might be, as Allison said, you might have a little system you have to hook up or something like that, or collect the water that way. But I would guess they have something out there that would treat the runoff for PCBs.
So this is Corey from City of Spokane Valley. I've heard that bioretention does a really good job of capturing and treating PCBs, but bioretention a lot of time connects people's MS4s. So
Alice and Paul, have either of you heard of
No,
bioswales?
again, I would talk to water quality about.
I want to go back real quick to a question that was a little bit higher up in the thread. I believe city demolition permits should be prohibiting PCB stormwater runoff from leaving the site per the most recent phase 2 NPDES permit. Was that in response to the previous question about the NPDES permit, or was that a separate question? For MK Joyner. It was just a comment. Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure that we weren't leaving anybody out. And that's, I think, some good additional.
Yeah, I would definitely guess that you're seeing a lot more of this in permits these days.
Fantastic. Well, if there's any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. In the meantime, I hope you will all join me in thanking our friends from Pacific Rim Environmental, Paul with the Washington State Department of Ecology, our funders.
Hold on, we got one more question. I'll answer before.
You discharge PCB contaminated runoff into sewer. Paul, that's a good one.
I would call your POTW before I did that. You could certainly dispose of some things in the sewer, but generally they're under a permit from your POTW.
Fantastic. And if anyone has any additional follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We really appreciate having you all here. I also just want to put out a reminder, Emma's information is here and in the chat. If you would like to host a similar event, either virtually or in person in your respective jurisdictions, because I know there's a lot of people from outside of King County here today, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We would love to come, and we have everything that you need to put on one of these education events for property owners in your area, including registration pages. We've got social media collateral, invitations, everything you could need to make this happen. And we want to help get the word out. So please reach out to Emma if you have any questions. Emma will also be sending out the slides at the end as a follow-up, so people can have access to those, along with our outreach toolkit for anyone interested in doing something like this in your own jurisdiction. We can make it extremely easy on you while helping to help reduce PCBs entering your water stream. So thank you again to everyone who joined us, to our amazing speakers, to Emma Dexter, who's just doing a fantastic job here on this PCB project side. Big thank you to the Strategic Stormwater Initiative, Washington State University, and the Washington State Department of Commerce. If anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to stick around. And as for the rest, thank you so much. Let us know if you're interested in pursuing continuing education credits, and we can help get that sorted out for you.